It's great to be here, even though I'm only here for this afternoon. I'm sorry I can't stay longer, because it'll be really great to meet you and chat to you, and I am here this evening. So I'm representing the Centre for Landscape Regeneration. I'm one of the co-investigators. The project as a whole is led by Emily Shuckborough and David Coombs, which themselves bring together two disciplines and schools from within the university. And I should thank Helen Driver, who's one of the programme coordinators, for quite a lot of the slides. I've put some at the end, which are mine. So the first part of this is just an introduction to the Centre for Landscape Regeneration, what we're doing or what we're trying to do. And then the second part is me thinking through the policies that we're trying to influence and how, some very honest views about how it's going. Okay, I can probably use this. Can I use that? No. So another one of the Changing the Environment programme projects. It's a 5-year grant. It's £10 million. It's a lot of people. And we are focused on managing landscapes. So we're keyed in from the very start to what is actually a very substantial change in the way that nature conservation and climate policy is happening in this country that's started in 2021, which is a scaling up to doing things at landscape scale. So we're thinking about how you solve the big problems of biodiversity loss or biodiversity decline and climate change at landscape scale. We're working in 3 different landscapes: the Fens in Cambridgeshire, which is a lowland peat landscape, the Cairngorms in Scotland, and Cumbria, which is the part of the Lake District. So we've got some partners, and we're really about looking at the problems of climate change and biodiversity loss in the context of food production and food security. Just some small little issues we're dealing with. And we're a very interdisciplinary team, and we are doing the co-designing with practitioners and stakeholders, so that was a really interesting conversation. This is our network. I'm sure there are some organisations on here that are on all of these. And I'm also not surprised to hear that some of the people, the individual people we're working with, have not spoken to the other people who are working with other projects in the same organisation. That happens to me a lot. You think you've got the partner solved, and then they're actually working with everybody in different places, and they don't even know. So anyway, so lots and lots of different partners, and the core partners here are RSPB, Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, NIAB, which is an agriculture and farming research organisation, and us at the University of Cambridge. These core partners do have funding from the project. And this is the team. It's enormous. These are all the different individual people and departments in a big network. More than 20 postdocs, 5 PhD students, 30 co-Is. So interestingly, more co-Is than postdocs, which is lots of fun, as you can imagine. And at the moment, we've got 6 summer interns as well. We did start off by mapping the stakeholders in the first landscape we were working in. And that itself is very complicated, because if you work at landscape scale, there's everything going on already.
As a planner, you can't. It just grows arms and legs.
Yes. So where we got to with that, having come into it and looked around at what was going on, we decided that there are already 3 groups of stakeholders that are working together to do different parts of this, and a lot of them had the same representatives on them. But we kind of focused on these nodes in order to connect with all of the people who are already in these landscapes. We've only done that for one of the landscapes so far. So this slide is just about the problems that are faced in the different landscapes. We've got Fenlands, which has got damaged wetlands, dramatic peat loss, water scarcity and flood risk, and those are the things that the stakeholder communities and all their different scales and formats are dealing with already. In the Cairngorms, it's cleared land, it's non-native forestry, managed moorland and damaged peat. It's much more straightforward in that landscape because I think it's almost entirely one landowner. And then we're working in the Cumbrian lakes and dales, where we've got iconic species missing and alpine meadows destroyed and rivers polluted and fells being denuded. So there's some quite different landscapes, some quite different issues. And what we are trying to do in the Centre for Landscape Regeneration is take the same kind of approach, and the aim is to get really high quality scientific research embedded in what happens in those landscapes. You can judge us at the end for whether we succeeded in that. So there's now a few slides about the sort of process that we're going through. We've got these different, what we call work packages. And the first one, this is looking at it from the Fenland context because we're working in the Fenland first. We haven't really started working in the other two landscapes yet. So the approach is to do a kind of trying to look at the whole system, mapping. In the case of the Fenland, we're mapping where is the peat. Amazingly, there isn't really a good map of where the deep peat is. And there's a huge amount of interest in where the deep peat is because of what it means for greenhouse gas emissions. So we're looking at the data, trying to get prehistoric and historical and modern day farmer-led approaches to that. So we're actually, through NIAB, we've connected with a project where we're getting the farmers to tell us where the deep peat is, because surprisingly enough, they know, at least for their fields and their farms. Well, it's not surprising at all that they know. They know better than the remote sensing people where the peat is. And then we're building guidance to support habitat management and restoration, which is towards evidence-based guidance. So that part of the project is with the conservation evidence team. There's a very large database now of scientific interventions being tested and summarised. And having got all the scientific information about the particular management actions for conservation, you actually need to combine it with the technical and knowledge and practical knowledge of the people who work on the ground. So this part of the project is trying to do that. And we had a trip to Chippenham Fen, which is one of the national nature reserves, I think, that we're in the Fenland landscape, talking to the site managers. What is it that you need to know? And then looking at the evidence that we have and trying to come up with a kind of evidence-based guidance which draws on all those different knowledge sources. And those conversations included things like peat management, whether or not it's okay to graze water buffalo and how you do that, and creating ponds and what to do about muntjac deer, which is a problem. The second part is where we're doing a lot of field work. So we're looking at the management, in the Fenland particularly, we're looking at what happens with different landscape managements to biodiversity and what happens to greenhouse gases. And it's very apparent that all of this hinges in the Fenland on water management. And crazy situation, it seems to everyone who gets involved in the Fenland, is that nobody knows how the water system actually works because it's all managed and governed in internal drainage boards who know about their bit. But individual farmers don't know how the water is flowing and quite often are surprised by sudden changes in water level that they weren't expecting. So it can be quite difficult to manage the water, and that's something we're grappling with. We have some hydrologists in the team. The third part of the work is this, what are the possible futures here? There's going to be a land use scenario, a set of scenarios, and we're going to be modelling the possible outcomes in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of socioeconomic outcomes, and in terms of biodiversity. What happens if we follow these different futures? We've got a whole team of economists and social scientists looking at these issues from an economic perspective, looking at the policies and how they're being implemented on the ground, and doing participatory research with farmers and also communities. We've also got outreach and education, so engaging with schools and engaging a lot with policymakers and with the enviro-tech industry, which is quite strong in Cambridge. These slides, by the way, I'm presenting them to you, but they're a sort of set that's been put together for which we present a lot to also the meetings we have with stakeholders and so on. So they're very high level and not particularly scientific. We've started doing field work, so we're getting real primary data in field work on greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity. We're also collecting secondary data on farm economic outcomes and other data, and all of the data will be put together and fed into this modelling. So the whole project fits together in a kind of what's going on in the landscape, what's actually happening on the ground, what might it look like in the future. So just a bit of an overview of the field work that we've got going on. We've got this greenhouse gas sensor network that we're going to test. We have a series of flux towers, some of which were in place already through the involvement of the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. Flux towers being these, the amazing thing about the first flux tower I saw is that it's proper ecological technology. It sounds really high tech, but it's sort of constructed around an old chair, which is stuck in the ground, and then there's some stuff built on the top of that, but bits of it are high tech, bits of it are low tech. It measures the flow of greenhouse gases coming out of the ground, and they're quite expensive to buy and put in. So the chemistry department people think that it might be cheaper and almost as effective to have an array of low-cost sensors, and what they can see with that is quite amazing, actually. So they've installed the sensors, and that's an important part of the project. Jack, who's here, is leading the biodiversity surveys at the moment in the Fens. So, and this is Neil, who's a PhD student on the project. So the pictures that I put on here this morning came from Neil, so they're all very beetle themed. But he's putting pitfall traps out, and there's a beetle, it's a carabid, it's a predatory beetle. There's been some very intensive fieldwork so far this summer, as you might have heard. Monthly survey rounds, and we're measuring species activity or density across farmlands of different management types and grassland and wild fen. We're getting loads of high quality biodiversity data, which, although there's a lot of data on biodiversity from these landscapes, not very much of it is of the quality that we're getting here. This is a slide that is us thinking about why the stakeholders should get involved. And it's quite a hard conversation sometimes, but there's a lot of interest from one of our stakeholder groups. They've really very actively involved in us, and that's a group of farmers called Fenland Soil. And they have convened themselves into a group of people because they feel they need to do something about the fact that they're farming the lowland peat and they're being tagged with massive greenhouse gas emissions. And what they see coming is we've got to stop farming the peat. And they quite like farming the peat because they've been doing it for a long time. It's very productive. They do quite well out of it. So they are very engaged, and because they and we have different but vested interests in trying to find a solution here where they can carry on farming at least some of what they're doing with reduced impact on the planet. So it's also about amplifying the voices of the fen and farming communities and trying to find pragmatic solutions to what is genuinely a problem. This is a problem landscape, everybody knows it. There's not enough water, it's completely unsustainable, some of the farming, and yet it's really productive and it's creating loads of jobs, and the communities are quite poor. There's a lot of problems in this. So that's actually most of what I'm going to say about the structure of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration. Now I'm going to tell you my thoughts on how to influence policy. So at the moment, I'm about as embedded in policy as I hope to ever be, I think, because I'm a board member of Natural England, as well as my normal job. And it's been enormously enlightening, but it's made me think a lot about how you influence policy. And I have been working in connecting with policy for quite a long time in my career. I was going to ask you, so what do you think is coming up on this slide? Would anyone like to throw some ideas before I tell you what my ideas were? How, as a scientist, do you influence policy? Maybe you think we shouldn't be trying to do that.
Case study taker?
Say that again. Data and case studies. Right, yes. That's.
I understand who's actually writing the policy and has the control over it.
That's closer.
In Scotland, for instance, all the land use policies are now being written by the government, and we've just been told to master that. So we have no influence on the policies unless we want to have on. So yeah, the politicians have got their sticky paws all over it as well.
Right. So the first thing on here is work with policymakers from the outset and keep talking to them all the way through, because otherwise you don't know what the policy is, and it's quite likely if you work and you're not talking to policymakers that your piece of data isn't really that relevant to what policy is going to do. And identify specific policy opportunities. And I mean really specific. Policy happens, it has nothing to do with research, it just gets on with it and happens and does stuff, and it's responding to all kinds of drivers. So you need to identify specific policy opportunities for change that are coming up in the future. Not they're coming up now. And think about the timing of the research outputs that are, and how your research outputs are going to relate to the cycle of policy development that's always going on. So policy will be instigated by some kind of political decision. It then has to be designed, then it'll be implemented, it'll be evaluated, and this whole cycle is running. And it's a different timescale for different policies. You need to think about which point in that your research outputs that could influence policy are going to appear and will be ready, whether they'll be ready at the right point. And then it's really important to aim to offer solutions that fit a policy need. And this comes back to the top one, which is working with policymakers from the outset. Make some time. If you want to influence policy with your research and have an impact in policy, you have to make some time in your day-to-day research life to actually talk to policymakers all the time if you can. So I'm just going to give you two examples. First of all, I'm going to show you some examples of us in the Centre for Landscape Regeneration doing the first few of these, working with policymakers, identifying policy opportunities. And then I'm going to talk about two specific policy examples that we ought to be influencing. So we've had several events with stakeholders. We had an event, the first one was the Lowland Agricultural Peak Conference, which was actually organised by Fenland Soil, which is one of our partner organisations. And that was very well attended by farmers and researchers and policymakers. We had a paludiculture conference, which a paludiculture, if you haven't heard of it, is farming other things other than food, but for fibre and things in a wetland environment. So you might be farming bulrushes or sphagnum or something and using it to generate products. It was an amazing conference. There's loads of building materials that you can make out of these different wetland. So the idea is we can go back to wetland in the fens and other big areas that have been drained whilst having a productive business if we just create a whole industry around what that landscape can naturally produce. That's paludiculture. So we had that, and we've also had a policy day where we had a lot of people from different government departments come and talk and listen and just discuss. And this is the right time in the project to do this in the first year. There's a few quotes from some of those events. I won't read them all because I think we'll probably share the slides after this, but the one that I thought was quite interesting was the biggest one on there, which says we're united around one common goal: to extend the usable life of lowland peat, to slow the loss of soil carbon and support profitable agriculture. For me, that's I wish it was one common goal. Feels like three different things, and that's why we need some research and a lot of conversation and trying to work out how we might do that one thing. Yeah, I won't read all the others out, but so one thing that's happened, and most of the first year of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration was most of our partners in the fens waiting for the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force to report, which was a group that was set up by the Department for Environment to discuss what to do about lowland peat. It is a problem because of the climate mitigation issues that it creates, because there's a lot of greenhouse gases coming off it, methane and carbon dioxide. So happily, the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force Chair's report has now come out. It came out about a week ago, I think. And because of that, I'm afraid I haven't read it. I was going to talk to you about it, but I haven't had time to read it. So I'm just going to put this slide up, which has got a live link to the Lowland Agricultural Peat Task Force report. And I think that some of my colleagues have read it. So we had some of our team were part of the task force, which gives us which embeds us in this process. What the task force report says is we need to reduce carbon emissions and address climate change, and it discusses the vulnerabilities of the farming sector to the extreme weather events that are coming already with us, and the potential of farmers to protect carbon in soils. It's difficult if you're farming peat. What you should do to keep the general wisdom is that what you should do to keep the carbon in the ground is wet the peat. And then you're expected to farm with very high water table, which the farmers will tell you you can't do. And even if you could wet it, you can't farm effectively. So that's the place that we sit with trying to work out how to do this. But this task force report creates a lot of opportunities for specific research on public perceptions, on consumer behaviour, on understanding the emissions from the wasted peat. So not all the peat on the fenland is deep. Quite a lot of it is already mostly blown away. Lots and meters of it. So it's kind of wasted peat or skirt peat, and it's sort of mixed with silty clay or something. It's not the same as. So you need to work out what's going on with the emissions from that kind of peat, or field trials, different techniques for peat preservation. So what you can see here, and I won't read all these out either, is lots of research ideas that came out that we could pick up. Now I'm going to talk about the policies, the big policies. How am I doing for time? Have I got 5 minutes left?
Yeah, a few more minutes.
Okay, thank you. So this is the timeline, starting in 2021, running up to 2027, in which the Centre for Landscape Regeneration and all of the other Changing the Environment projects fit. We started at the start of 2022, and we've got 5 years. And we're working in these 3 landscapes. We're doing field work in the fens here for 2 years, and then we're moving next year to the Cumbria and the Cairngorms, and we're doing field work there. We are operating in the context, as I said at the start, of some seismic shifts in environmental policy in this country, particularly nature, but also agriculture. So here are the drivers for those big shifts. Well, the main driver is actually Brexit. We left the European Union, we left all the environmental regulation, we left the Common Agricultural Policy. After a few years of wrangling and lots of people feeling very anxious about this, we have in 2021 the Agriculture Act and the Environment Act. The Agriculture Act takes out the basic payment for farmers with a 7-year ticking time bomb up to that. still paying them at the moment, 7 years from now, after 2021, oh, no more basic payment. Instead, we're going to have public money for public goods. So we're only going to pay farmers for environmental benefits that they can do. This is a huge shift in the way that farming works. The Environment Act introduces some statutory targets to halt species extinction and, amazingly, to stop the decline in abundance of species based on the measured abundance of different animals, and that includes lots and lots of insect species and many common species. So that's quite incredible as an environmental policy that's now in the statute. But what this has driven is a new set of policies. The Sustainable Farming Incentive is about how farmers manage fields. What was local nature recovery and turned into countryside stewardship, and landscape recovery projects. Now these are all at different scales and they're placed on this timeline. So you can see the Sustainable Farming Incentive happened really quickly. And then the local nature recovery thing languished for a bit and then got rebranded and turned into countryside stewardship. That's still in the pilot phase. It's not really coming in until 2024. And landscape recovery projects, the same. There's lots of thinking and some trials and some pilots on these. Together, these three things are the low, middle and higher tier of the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which completely replaces the basic payments. And then from the Environment Act, we have something called landscape recovery strategies. These are also completely new. This is a mandate from government for England that all of some stated authority areas, which are not all exactly the same in terms of the political structures, have to produce landscape recovery strategies, which means a plan of what's going on with nature. And in Cambridgeshire, it was mandated to the Greater Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Authority, who said that the county council would do it, who said, oh, I think this organisation called Natural Cambridgeshire, this partnership organisation, might do it. Whatever happens, all of these areas across the whole of England have to have a strategy for what they're going to do for nature by 2025. So, and behind all of this, there's a cliff edge for farmers, which is your basic payments are stopping. So that's the context. This is one of the Environmental Land Management Scheme is very complicated and it keeps changing. The new lot is just out in June. There's a handbook. So we're trying to match our research to that so that the farm management that we're looking at, we're actually testing some of those things, but we're not early enough in the cycle to actually influence what goes into this. This is a basic level with some payments. This is an intermediate level. And the local nature recovery strategy is being put together by Natural Cambridgeshire. This is the area of Cambridge. This is the map we've got so far, which is going to form that with some different landscapes where nature recovery will be focused. And this is going to have quite some influence on what happens next. And that green oval there, that's where we're working in our field sites in the Fenland. So we can have a huge amount of relevant, very policy relevant research. But if I just go back to our timeline, the point at which you can influence these policies as they develop is on these arrows. Once they're in place, it's much harder to influence them. So for some of these things, we're kind of a bit late. We can still do very useful policy relevant research. We'll be about informing what comes next. We're evaluating the existing policy. We should be looking at what's coming after this lot. So that's the policy environment we're working in. I'm very happy to take questions. I'm going to stop. Thank you for listening.